Okay, well, welcome one and all. This is the virtual Toronto Summer Institute expansion into ideas that matter in our learning marketplace. And today we are privileged to have Derona King, who has already done a session and has volunteered to do a bit more with us. Derona is the Director of Citizen Advocacy of Atlanta and DeKalb, and has been involved with citizen advocacy for about 3 decades, including 15 years as the director. I don't want to take a lot of time, except that I think that what you need to know about Derona is that she is a master storyteller, which means that she is masterful at listening, and she is able to gather people's stories. So she is a gatherer of souls, and she takes those little pieces, those nuggets of soul stories, shares them, and creates life partnerships that make a difference to people. It's a privilege. And over to you, Derona. Welcome.
Yay. Thanks, Jack. That was very kind of you. And looking out at the thumbnails, I'm really happy that I recognize many of the names and faces. And I'm so very glad you're here, taking time out of your day just to hear some of what's been percolating in my spirit. Jack asked something of me this morning about where is this coming from, and it's really these are stories that I feel like that are being birthed. The whole experience of sharing citizen advocacy stories, particularly on a wider scale, is a very new experience. And the stories that I really feel compelled to share are stories that have been lingering for a bit, and you get to be a part of the birthing process, as it were. So, yeah, I'm the director of the Citizen Advocacy Program in Atlanta and DeKalb, and a little background about what that is. So, citizen advocacy is, for us here in Georgia, 43-year social experiment, I believe, on helping our communities locally think about better ways to engage people vulnerable to disability discrimination in a very practical way. And we call that citizen advocacy. Citizen advocacy comes out of the brain, the heart and mind of Dr. Wolfensberger. And I like to think about all the work he invested in thinking about people who have been historically pushed to the margins of any society, and then how those particular folks were able to be brought back to the center of society. And so where we focus on that here in Georgia is specifically around people who have been labeled with developmental disabilities and who may be experiencing some risk around social exclusion, harm, physical harm, emotional harm, isolation, and discrimination. And the privilege that I've had since 1993 is gathering stories, not intentionally, but hearing of the lives of people who have connected in some way and have impacted each other, their wider communities, and to a very significant part, they've impacted me and they've changed me. And so as we journey into storytelling in this way, it really is personal. It really is very much my sitting on the outside, looking in and learning not only what people can come to mean to one another, but how their meaning to one another really is something that we can all learn from. So we're going to begin. I think we all have stories. I know we all have stories, and not only our own stories, but we're carrying others' stories in a way that only we can tell. And so part of how we're going to begin just exploring the stories that we have inside of us already is I'll have a chance to tell you guys a short piece of a story that I've had the privilege of knowing, but for you to begin thinking about what are the stories that you hold yourself. What kind of impact has someone maybe close or even at a distance, has their walk done, that you think is something to share with other people? And I'm calling my stories legacy stories, specifically around citizen advocacy. I've been thinking a great deal about the loss of people, and I had to take a shift in my own mind that maybe it's not a complete loss, as we've seen people leave this earth and this since the pandemic, particularly. That if I continue telling their stories, if I can continue to share how their lives impacted me, perhaps that could benefit us in an ongoing way. So we're going to begin the process of storytelling. One of the things that I think has happened in my life being a part of the citizen advocacy framework is that I've honed some skills around not just storytelling, but as Jack mentioned, kind of the precursor for storytelling is the story listening, and being prepared to find the meaning in a story, no matter where it comes from, and or who it comes from. The fact that I get to meet people who have rarely had their stories told in a dignified and enhancing way has even forced me through the decades of listening to people who perhaps communicate in a different way, listening to people whose stories have been told by people who did not regard or respect their humanity, and subverting that paradigm, turning it upside down, where the beauty of that person is what gets illuminated and the gifts of that person is what gets presented, rather than often what is demeaning um, from their story. So you were given some homework if you registered and received, which I'm sure you did, the notes from Linda. Part of the storytelling is just even beginning to practice to use your own words, sometimes in a different way. And I intentionally selected questions for you to introduce yourselves as you go into the first breakout, is to begin thinking about who you are, not based upon what somebody else says about you or has described you or given you a job description as. So the Jack, if those questions are available in terms to put up on the screen of how we wanted people to introduce themselves. And if not, I can read mine.
I just posted them in the chat, Derona.
Okay, awesome. So you're going to introduce yourself, either share when you were into your breakout, who you are by your name, but something that you're really good at, and we're going to keep it within the 30-second range, and or state where you're from and what you do in your community or job, but please do not use your job title or that formal description. What are the gifts that you're bringing to your community? So if you're supporting someone today to tell their story, I really do ask that you help them use their own words. And we're going to ask you to put it in the chat. We've been thinking about how this breakout is going to work. And I think we landed on people are going to remain in their, is this correct, Linda? They're going to remain kind of in their same pod throughout today. So you'll have a chance to, as you introduce yourself to your group, when you come back, you won't have to do that again. People will have some predisposition to who you are and what you're bringing into the conversation. And we're going to ask that someone takes the real quick initiative when you land in this first section to be the listener We want you to interact, but we want you to be able, if you can capture some of the ideas and thoughts, anything that sticks out in terms of how someone describes themselves, would you be willing at that point to say, yep, I'm going to do that. I'm going to jot this down. It doesn't have to be formal, and drop it into the chat. Linda, did you want to say anything more about how we want to capture that or describing?
Well, so Derona's invitation is that one person in each group step up. It could be different every round, but someone step up to be the scribe. And if you will type into the chat in your small group some of the notes or highlights that you just mentioned, Derona, and the names of the people in your group, that would be excellent. And we'll see if we can then ask people to put those notes in the chat to everyone. But try scribing, if you would, in the chat in your small group.
Yeah. And if someone could be the timekeeper in your group, that would be good too. Someone other than the person who's scribing, say, I'll keep a watch on the clock. We are going into the first session with 10 minutes.
Okay.
We're everybody's back. Yeah. All right. So now here's some work for the scribes. Linda, can you just say what it is that they're doing so that I don't mess up the copy paste?
I sure will. We're just trying the experiment here, folks, of if people scribed into the chat to invite the scribes, as Tracy did, to copy and paste what was in your own private group chat and put it into the chat to everyone. That should work. So let's just see. And if it doesn't, then you can copy and paste from wherever you were typing, or just type it into the chat.
So I'm looking, and we're not going to do a lot of mining here, but I'm really impressed already with how you responded to the question. Jillian in Georgia helps people create good lives and is a connector. Love it. Jack in Toronto, settler from Treaty 4, Conciliation and Graphics. Tracy in Nebraska is a connector, roller skater. Gail in Wisconsin is community building and involvement in quilting. Oh, I love it. Patty, prototype new ideas. Maureen, the more difficult the problem, the more we learn. Sandra, very observant and curious about people, mutual learning opportunities. I see Jenny, inspiring people to enable participation in life and society through various creative ways, letting them own the process. Yeah. Jenny, inspiring people to enable full community participation. So very, very cool. That was just, I love it when we can really get to know one another and touch where people are in a different way. And what you're doing is you're giving us opportunities to listen differently and not assume that we know who you are. Graham in Kentucky, volunteer at a community kitchen that is purpose-driven. Okay, McAtee, people person who is really helpful. Steve in Kentucky, storyteller and community curator. And Carol in New York State, connector, purpose-driven, curious and striver to be a good listener. Shanae, writing, storytelling, and networking. Brianna, reading and writing. Bridget, gardening, growing with people. Tim, imagining fun things, messing with rules. Beth, weaving stories, people, ideas, and possibilities, picking up on pieces that want to be woven in, but are unseen or not as appreciated. I love this. Jack tries new things with enthusiasm. Oh, you guys are wonderful. Thank you. Let's see if I don't want to miss anybody. Savannah shows up in community as a listener. Well, welcome into the space. It looks to me very much so like the right people are here today for this time that we're having. If there's anybody that got missed in the introducing yourselves, scribing, go ahead and drop it in. It's never too late to type in how you answered, who you are, and what you're doing. Um, Thank you. Thank you. We're going to move on then, it looks like. I just want to make sure I haven't missed anyone. Hope, Mary Joyce, devaluation is so alive in the world. So if you take the first no, nothing is going to happen. It takes a lot of effort, question, challenge, and change of the status quo. I am the think bigger, do more. This is not optional person. Isn't that a great way to tell your story? This is your story, what you guys have done today. One of the ways that I started telling my citizen advocacy story is I practiced really hard how to say what I do in what might be colloquially called like an elevator speech. You know, I just have a couple of seconds, and I'm not really trying to tell people the whole story. I want to provoke people to want to know more when I'm telling a story. So unlike some stories that are told the long story, and that's where you want to get to in your storytelling. You want to have the opportunity to share the long story. I think what we're going to do today, if you guys are familiar with the work of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who did the Danger of a Single Story, which is really profound and was very instrumental with me even understanding how important it was to listen to tell the story correctly. Her focus is expanding the story so that a person gets the full breadth of what's going on. And that's so important. Given the work that probably many of you do in meeting people whose stories potentially haven't been told, and to be able to communicate how you tell the story, I think it's equally important to be able to capture the essence of whatever you're doing in a very thoughtful way to communicate the story so that the listener wants to hear more, that the listener wants to come back. The listener is waiting for the next invitation. So that's some of what this was birthing, I think, and has been growing inside of me for since '93, of beginning with the citizen advocacy journey. So why tell it through the lens of citizen advocacy? Well, that's the work that I've been doing for some time now. And for those of you who don't know citizen advocacy, and I want to give a little background with it because I'm going to tell you a story, a piece of a story. That began very early on. I think it's really important, as I've been reflecting on what I'm calling these legacy stories, to continue to tell them, because what I found myself doing is when people maybe died, or a citizen advocacy relationship was no longer active or engaged for whatever reason, I found that I wasn't telling the story anymore. And I actually just convicted in that the things that people experience together, the things that I learned, the things that the story could possibly continue to teach us, honors the people who did the work in the relationship in the first place, prepares for other people to hear how they can also participate in their own journeys. And it's really a privilege. It's an honor to have someone's story. How I often describe the work that I do. So citizen advocacy enables me to meet a person vulnerable to disability discrimination who likely have not had their story told in a way that maybe they would want to tell it themselves. and I do get to listen. And one of the things that how I envision that is that I am a vessel. I'm a vessel capturing the who of who somebody is. And I find myself even in my physical discipline of sitting before someone. If you can see on Zoom, my hands are cupped and up so that I'm holding a story. And I will say to that person whose story I'm listening to and describing what it is that I'm trying to do with citizen advocacy, I will say, well, I'm here today, I'm listening, and I'm going to hold a piece of your story. And what I'm going to do with that story is I'm going to carry it through my community until I find the right person who will almost be, in essence, the person who will extend their hands back to receive the story. And I'm going to pour that I've received of you into that person, so then that now the two of you can begin to create another story. And for me, in listening to people, I almost do that with everybody that I meet now, that I'm trying to listen and I'm trying to hear, that I can take that in my hand, and what I pass along to the next person would be just the beginning of something that hopefully will grow bigger. And it's a privilege. It's an honor to hear people's story. Their impact is significant. Their lives are absolutely worth sharing in that way, and we can help. Some people's stories in citizen advocacy, they're people who have grown old together. Their stories have matured, and other people have taken on their stories to tell. And Georgia's been doing citizen advocacy in this way for about 43 years. And now Tom Kohler's on the call. He was the director of the Chatham Savannah Citizen Advocacy Program. So the Chatham Savannah Citizen Advocacy Program, Macon, and the community that I'm in, Atlanta, began about the same time. We began under the auspices of the Georgia Advocacy Office, and they're the real system. They're the federally mandated entity for protection and advocacy. But because there were people in Georgia who were familiar with Dr. Wolfensberger's work, had studied with and learned with him, knew that if we were going to do a protection and advocacy system in Georgia, that there was a possibility for it to look different than the rest of the nation, with the exception of Nebraska, which is on, and they've done the same. So at the start of the Georgia advocacy offices, these three programs that I mentioned were under the Georgia Advocacy Office before going independent. And about that time, there were a couple of relationship stories that were being developed even before the formal citizen advocacy program. So I want to share with you just a piece of that early story. One of the earliest citizen advocacy stories in the state of Georgia is the story of Denise and Mary Yoder. And they, I believe, as one of the first stories, and the life of that story held for 43 years, is what we would hope could happen in any community, in any relationship, where people actually develop a life together and protect and support one another. So I'm going to share with you just a piece of the story of how I heard the story coming in. And remember, this story began back in, thank you, Jack. This is Mary and Denise in the kitchen, where life happens in family, with Mary and Denise. Mary shared the story with me early on, how she first met Denise, and it was back in 1975 as the Georgia Advocacy Office was really forming. Mary had been involved, actually probably with Jillian Gravel, who's on the call, doing some work with Project Rescue, and Project Rescue, and had been meeting people in Georgia who were in institutions locally in Georgia. And about that time, the Georgia Advocacy Office, in their connection, had met a child who was then living in the Brook Run Hospital, it was called at the time. The former name, to give you a better picture of where this hospital, what this hospital was the Georgia Retardation Center. And the move forward for the state of Georgia was to call it Brook Run Hospital. And mind you, it wasn't a hospital where you would think that people there weren't sick. So Denise was a young child. She had already spent most of her early years at living in this institution, and she was introduced to Mary Yoder. And Mary tells the story of going on her very first visit to meeting this young girl who was about 8, 9, or 10 at the time. She was ushered into a room at Brook Run, and it was a kind of like a quasi classroom with children's toys, and there were several children playing in the classroom. Now, prior to meeting Denise, Mary had been given the institutional rap sheet on Denise. So the very opposite of what we hope that we're creating with telling the stories. All of the harmful things and some of the, I don't even repeat what Mary told to me, because there are words that describe this child in less than human ways. And I learned about the work that I'm doing, not from sitting necessarily in a formal tutorial, but listening to people who are advocates like Mary describing what life was like for Denise. So Mary goes and she sits and she's waiting for folks to bring Denise to her in this classroom, quasi classroom. And at some point, the human services worker comes back in, and Mary says, well, I've been sitting here and I'm waiting to meet Denise. The human services worker, social worker potentially, says to Mary, well, that's Denise right there. She's been in here in this room with you the entire time. The story that Mary had received to describe who Denise was so heinous that she couldn't possibly imagine that any of the children in the room with her was Denise. And that struck her, as it still strikes me today, that people who are paid to, say, protect and provide services for people define them in such a way that no one would recognize who they were. So that was her first encounter. Mary began visiting Denise at Brook Run pretty regularly, just dropping in and getting to know her. And it got to be about Christmas time, during the holidays, was when she was most struck by what her role might be for Denise. Mary tells a story of walking down the long corridor to the nurses' station on this particular Christmas holiday, where nearly every single child was away from the facility with family, with friends, with someone, with the exception of this 8 or 9-year-old little girl, Denise. It was Denise, and it was the staff during Christmas that struck Mary in such a way that she understood how profoundly separate, segregated, and isolated Denise's story was working out to be. And she said that's when she really knew that she was being called to something very specific, and began then a journey of getting to know Denise in a different way. And she did. She and her husband determined that they were going to be the family, even then, that Denise didn't have. And she chronicled a childhood that Denise would not have had. Things like coming to her house for the weekend or for holidays, ensuring when Denise got to her house that she had all the things that other kids in the neighborhood had, like bikes and coloring books and doll babies to play with. And one of the most significant things that she did that taught me about the difference between children who are segregated or children who are institutionalized is that she continually, throughout Denise's childhood, took photographs and pictures. That resonates with me. My husband is a photographer, and every movement from the time our children were born, we created these photographic memories of them. And it's what people take for granted about people, particularly young people who are segregated, is that there's no documentation of their childhood. So already Mary and Tim, her husband, were chronicling a childhood. And even to this day, if you went to their house, there were photo albums and stacks of trips and places and things that children do that if Mary weren't in Denise's life, she would never have had. Well, throughout her schooling, Tim and Mary helped with things that you would think an advocate might help with, going to IEPs, trying to ensure that she got an education. And along the way, Denise began to be placed in foster care homes. The journey for Mary and Tim was to get Denise out of the institution. The system way was to place her in foster homes. And I remember Mary telling me and looking in her eyes, and she was so brokenhearted. She said, "We really wanted to bring Denise home to live with us. We really wanted to adopt her. But this was the situation in Georgia," she said, in the 80s, in the late, even the late 80s and 90s. They were a white couple. And the system told them that they couldn't adopt or take home this Black girl. And they invested resources to keep her in foster care because the system didn't find it appropriate for this couple who wanted a child to be with them. And that went on throughout Denise's childhood. And it wasn't until she was 23 or 24, and she was no longer held captive by the state of Georgia foster system, that she was actually able to go and have a real home with this family that had loved her throughout her childhood. Mary and Tim built an apartment, renovated their home and built an apartment for Denise. And Denise lived in her apartment for decades. Denise, the rap sheet that I call it for Denise is that she would never be able to do anything on her own, that she wouldn't hold a job, that she wouldn't finish school, all the wouldn't, shouldn'ts. She was born in 1965, and she left this earth after a long bout with cancer on October 1st, 2018. During her life here on earth, Denise worked at a job that she worked at longer than any other employee. People came to tell the story of how important she was at working at this job and that consistency. And I can remember Denise saying, "I never missed work until I got breast cancer," and how important her job was to her and how important she was to the people that worked with her. She was a pinnacle in the community. She got on our MARTA, our transit system, and went to work every day. She served on boards of directors. She went on vacation. Until the day she died, she went to school to work to get her GED. It remained important to her, and it remained as something that Mary and Tim held up as important and supported her through. And when I asked them several years ago to tell me about their relationship, Denise said, "If it weren't for Mary, I would be dead." Mary said, "If it weren't for Denise, I wouldn't have a best friend." The power of the work that I get the privilege of doing is that significant, that people's lives are changed. And I think not for just the time that Denise walked the earth, but her memory is held as a family member to not just Mary and Tim, but to their extended family, to the neighborhood that she ultimately lived in with Mary and Tim. And they modeled to the world, to the community, that what we perceive as different on the outside, no matter where we start, that we can end up as family together. And citizen advocacy gives me the privilege of helping people find their own calling to be together to create a new story. So what I want you to think about as we begin the next breakout session is there a story that has resonated with you personally about someone who has walked close to you or even from a distance, that whose story likely isn't being told by anyone else, that you could hold up to present the gifts of that person in just a few words? Think about what might be created by the two people potentially that are in the story. Or is there an individual who's walking and not being seen, whose story you're carrying? And I think about folks who walk by. If you're in a city like I am, that has even a population of people who don't live in typical dwelling places, the people that we walk by, whose story have you witnessed and seen that you could tell? And even to begin thinking about who should hear the story and what could it be. So we're going to go into the next breakout, and what I think that we've done, you're going to be in your same, we're calling them pods, and you were given a couple of questions to reflect upon, which I should have reminded you before I began telling the story. But as you go back into your pods, I want you to, there are a couple of themes that I hope that you'll think about. So pod 1 and 5, I think.
I'm going to post this in the chat, Derona.
Oh, cool. So if you look in the
so you can
chat,
say it, but I'm going to put it up.
I'm going to, yeah. We're in your chat, the small group that you were initially in. So pod 1 is Danietta, Heather, Hope, and Tom. And pod 5, I'm going to say those because you're doing the same reflection, Carol, Graham, and Stephen. Would you be willing to think about the story that you just heard, the very short story of Mary and Denise? Be willing to think about how their story counters negative attitudes and assumptions about vulnerable people? So one question that you're going to think about if you're pod 1 and 5, how the story of Mary and Denise counters negative attitudes and assumptions about vulnerable people. Got it? So our next pod 2 is Ashley, Jack Yates, Catherine and Susanna. And pod 6, Gail, Jack P., Tracy, and Jillian. Would you be willing to think about if the story illuminated a reciprocal relationship? And if so, how? How does the story illuminate reciprocal relationship? Pod 3, Jenny, Maureen, Patty, and Sandra. Would you be willing to think about how does the story redefine family? How does the story of Mary and Denise redefine family? And then pod 4, Beth, Shanae, Tim and Bridget, would you be willing to reflect upon how what you heard in the story of Mary and Denise, how would it be possible for that kind of story to strengthen community? We're going with, I think, 15 minutes here.
Right.
Somebody's going to scribe. It doesn't have to be the same person. And a timekeeper. Linda, go ahead. I'm sorry.
We had someone join us from Mattingly Edge, and I just need to add Claire and Liz into one of the pods, which I will do right now.
All right. So you have your assignments. I can't wait to hear what you come up with. Hi, everybody. I'm really, really excited. Welcome back into the space. So we're going. Great. Somebody's already started. So we're going to want to get some of the scribes, or all of the scribes, if you can copy the notes that you took, paste them back into the chat that we can all begin to take a look at. And Jack, if you can help me here, I'm going to see if we can't, if I can.
Where to start.
Yeah, let's see. I think what we can do is we can look at the pods and maybe go in that order. Maybe, possibly, potentially, maybe, yeah. I had a note somewhere about who was where.
Derona, do you want to invite people by the theme, maybe?
Yeah, why don't we do that? Because as it's scrolling, it's not easy for me to see. So you were pod, I believe 1 and 5 were a pod, thinking about how the story counters negative attitudes and assumptions about vulnerable people. Who wants to pop in then and just let us hear what you came up with?
Who's reporting on that or putting into the chat?
Derona, are you inviting somebody to speak to the whole group?
I am, but so I needed to retype. I do have some already.
Okay.
Let me just put in what.
Okay. I was trying to find Danietta what that was, and if you're not ready, we can pop on to see if somebody else is. Thanks. But are you ready? What did you hear? What did you guys?
Well, we had a really healthy conversation about all of the counter negative, all the fact that it countered negative assumptions about vulnerable people. The fact that even though the system was in place to separate, there was still a way after that time for love to find its way, because who gets to decide who is in a relationship? I guess that's the question. Is it a system, or is it truly people that want to be together? That was what came up. And,
nice.
Also, if the assumption was, a person with a disability cannot be a proper friend. I think Heather mentioned this, but yet their friendship lasted for so long and it was so genuine and real. And the other assumption around not being able to work, yet she held that position for the longest in her job. So, and then the other thing that came up was around photos and how important photos are. And if we did not see that picture, we all would have probably conjured up some other image that might not have been a favorable image, because of our human nature. So we looked at that. And so the beauty of having pictures was real important to the relationship.
Love it. That love finds a way. Yeah. Love finds a way. I love that. Thank you, Danietta.
Beautiful.
Pod 2 was Ashley, Jackie Yates, Catherine, Susanna. Oh, I'm sorry. Before we do that, there was Carolyn Graham and Stephen
Yep.
also were reflecting on that. Thank you, Carol. I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you. No, and that was wonderful. And some of my chat, I think it's too long, so it got locked off when I cut and pasted. So appreciate this opportunity.
Okay.
Real quick highlights were just the whole idea of valued social roles, and how profoundly they came out, sitting on boards, being at the top of an organization, and really smashing the ceiling of assumptions about people's capacity and ability to do that. The segregation, that hands people assumptions about who somebody is. And so the counter to that was the challenge, right? The changing of the assumptions, that occurred when, Denise was just the world into regular life, right? Taking a bus to and from work like anybody else, and holding a job longer than anybody else at the company. And we were also struck by the depth on the genuineness, the authenticity of that transcending friendship that they had, that if I didn't have Denise, I would be dead. And then if I didn't have Mary, right, I wouldn't have a best friend. And so those were really, really profounding insights. And then we had a really great conversation just from, a whole nother perspective. Graham shared some of his own perspective, about the story. So it was a great opportunity. I was out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Ashley, Jack, Catherine, and Susanna, who was your scribe, and who wants to plug back in on that?
Well, I took the notes. I'm Catherine, so I can share. I put it in the chat. I put it in the chat box for anyone that's helpful for.
Okay.
And our topic was about the reciprocal relationship.
Right.
And so that statement that you had shared in the story at the beginning about Mary saying, or Denise saying, without Mary, I would be dead. And Mary saying, without Denise, I would have a best friend, really gives you clues to just how reciprocal their relationship was. And the value that each party was giving and receiving, as a form of the life they had together. And it made us think a lot about some of the people we know and some of the work that happens in person-centered planning. And, Jack shared when you're doing planning with people and not asking the team just about what are the skills the person has or what does the person like, but asking about what is the contribution that the person makes to you, for you, in your world, in your community, and hearing that piece, and how much richer that information is, in the way that it helps a person think about a positive possible future. And how do we get information from many team members? And just the value of, if people haven't had the opportunity to learn about reciprocal relationships and learn about not just contribution, but intentional contribution of what you want to give. Sometimes that can be one-sided in a service system type of world, but that importance of both parties understanding that value and having that opportunity, because that's where the joy is, in what you get to contribute and give, versus just what receiving. So that was us.
Thank you. That was awesome. And pod 6 also we're looking at the reciprocal relationship piece. Pod 6. And if you've got a scribe for Pod 6, I would think did anybody touch on or think about what, if you're thinking about reciprocal relationship, what that means about raising expectations, even in the beginning in a relationship? But I'll let you guys. Was that Gail and Jack and Tracy and Jillian? Who's the scribe there?
Tracy was a scribe. That's me.
Okay.
I'm not certain. We got into expectations, but let's see. We also talked about wouldn't be alive, best friends. That statement. Mary's gatherings included Denise for her entire life. The relationship was kind of embroidered into the gatherings. Denise's job was through Mary's connection. Even the idea of becoming family was reciprocal. We talked about the relationships between the two and one another, mutually repaired wounds, incremental improvements over time, and providing the energy to keep the relationship going came from both of them. They both created a climate of reciprocality, and they both brought their gifts to the relationship. And we talked about Denise and her gift choosing was evidently one of her gifts, that she gave good gifts to people.
All right, thanks. And we're watching time, and I do apologize. Pod 3 redefines family. Anybody from Pod 3?
We just really focused on creating a new definition of what family is, that it's not based on blood, it's about choice. It's about love and being there for each other over time. Who's there for you, spends your big moments with you, loves you no matter what, even at your lowest. But it just really came back to the fact that it's about who you choose and who chooses you. And that if we can do that, then we also open up the opportunity for expansion. Things grow as we open up that definition and be more creative about what it looks like. Just as Denise's life grew through Mary's connections, and there was an expansion of her world as a result, and in regards to family also. And a different definition allows for people to be themselves, but to be seen differently from a different perspective. So people don't have to change to fit into something. They're accepted for who they are, because the people that are there who they choose as family are choosing to be there for who they are, not try to fit them into a box. And towards the end, we started thinking about how race, culture, and orientation have gotten in the way in the past and even today of becoming a family. And how do we answer a systemic problem when it's really about these relationships and people talking to each other that answers the question?
Jenny, that's awesome. You guys are rocking this out. So in the interest of time, this next group, Pod 4, Beth, I gotta go with, I don't know who was describing that group, but I know that you have connections. Beth, on Pod 4, would you talk about that strengthening community? Maybe we'll do that one point, and then we'll move on.
Let's see. Bridget, Bridget was our note taker.
Bridget Scribe. Okay, great.
I was the scribe, but Beth had all the insight that helped us get to know even more in the bigger community, that just because the story, mainly about their relationship, but we could kind of jump in and share that, Beth can speak to the even generations of people that were impacted by the relationship and Denise being present, and how that kind of changed the story and their perspectives, and changed the way the community looks at people and values them. Shanae kind of shared that people with disabilities have to overcome a lot in their life, and what that does to make them stronger people, and that in that way they're there to be able to help other people and to learn and to grow. So that'll be my really quick summary for you.
Thank you, guys. I'm just amazing, and I hope what we lifted up in the story, and it's just a short piece of the story, right? There's so much more. That real relationship breaks down barriers across class, culture, time, and we can go back and use those kind of modifiers to even think about the story. If you're working within community, how do you think about building relationship and then telling the stories that become the chain of something or someone else? Because it's really important that Denise and Mary and Tim's story continues to be told. They sit in a position in their neighborhood, in their community, in our city, and maybe now through Zoom in the world. You can tell a story of real people who subverted the dominant paradigm just by living their lives. And so now I'm so glad to see faces. I see Tim and Bridget. I didn't see them before. Hi, you guys. The next section is probably going to be harder. And if you didn't see, I'm going to read where we're going to move into, because here's the chance now for, if you've had a chance to think about a story that you've held, or that maybe the story is holding you, we're going to invite you to share or to listen, I like this, with your inner voice about a story that you're carrying that lifts the humanity and dignity of someone you know or knew, and to share that. Each of you will get a chance in your small group, but here's the thing, you got about 3 minutes to do so. But if you think you're going to want to do more listening, that's okay. But we're going to ask that, particularly here, that the timekeeper watches for everybody in the 3 minutes apiece, as well as when we're coming back out of it. And we're losing Hope. Sorry, Hope. Thank you for dropping on. So we're losing Hope. So whoever is in their group, you get like an extra 30 seconds, right? Anyway, but is there a story that you can bring forth now that lifts up the dignity of someone? And can you do this in a way that someone will even want to come back and hear more? We have 20 minutes.
Derona, even if we're losing hope, we still have faith and love.
Ta-da-da. All right. We're before we break, also want to remind, keeping your themes in mind that are in your head, and you don't have to stick with them, but it will help with time if we keep the same kind of themes as we're telling the story. If you can hear that and what you are, I love, someone said that joke. I'm sorry, that's awesome. But if you can hold on to those, like countering negative attitudes, particularly if we just hold up that one theme, does your story counter negative attitudes and assumption? Let's just, because of the interest of time, let's just stick there. All right. I'll see you back in 20. Are we doing? Oh, we are all back, guys. Thank you. Go ahead. We're going to just let you go ahead and start dropping in, if there's scribes or any of you want to drop into the chat what you heard, as you were listening into the story about, noticing how what people were saying or countering those negative attitudes and assumptions. Go ahead and drop those in. And while folks are doing that, just because we're running up against the clock there, while we're doing that, if there's something that you just got to get out, You want to raise your hand electronically, or I'll try to look and see about, what did bubble up, or are there any themes that you heard in your group? If there's anyone that wants to give any feedback, we've got time to take a couple of people, people's, and we'll just let folks go ahead and don't. Is there a hand?
I'll start. Yeah.
Okay.
Go. Stealing a story from Catherine in our group. Very dramatic. That here was a fellow.
Think about themes, Jack. I don't want to interrupt you, but if you think about, we want to go big theme rather than don't tell the whole story. Just give the big theme about.
Yeah.
What?
Okay. Sorry.
Okay.
Yes. So when the climax of the story, the end of the story, was Catherine saying to herself, "Thank God he's still alive." But alive means alive instead of dead, but alive means other things. And that nobody else in his community probably saw this fellow as somebody who had a gift to offer. But he offered a gift to Catherine, and she's told us that story. And so now there is more than one person in the world who knows that he has a gift to offer us.
That's beautiful. Thank you. That was beautiful. Anybody else had their hand up before, or we can start pulling out of the chat? Anybody? Somebody, go ahead. Carol, countering stereotypes about who can have sex, about being able to live on my own, about inventing new language and ways of listening and sharing conversation. There you go. Stephen, is your hand up?
Yeah. So I just wanted to just point out, and this is probably maybe a theme in all of these stories, but in the three of the stories in Pod 5, which I was part of, just how profoundly as human beings we impact one another in ways that we never expect. Like you just seemingly randomly meet people and they can change your whole life by introducing you to things you never thought about before. And just how beautiful that is.
Yes, I love that.
Gail told a tiny bit of Darwin's story, which is indeed a remarkable story, but a man who was essentially incarcerated for 40 years and then came out and lived a remarkable life of contribution. And although he's just passed, his story is just beginning, because it's been already been shared in many ways. And what I think we were all collectively scheming, it needs to be shared some more.
Hopefully this ignites folks, in this space, right, to remember that and to figure out a way to do it.
Yep.
I love it. Any other hands? Go ahead and chime in if you've. Wow. Heather talked about a personal story that is holding her. She talked about her loving relationship with her and her husband who had a disability. Yeah. That's certainly a theme of that I think I see, personal stories are popping up. Very good. Jillian, Nick P., Greek, lives in a long-term care facility, but would like out, hopes to participate in a Habitat for Humanity build. Yeah. How, thinking about just from those words, how does that counter negative assumptions and stereotypes? Nick wants to live he wants to live, right? And apparently there's something keeping him in a long-term care facility. People need to know that. Let people own the story of their life. Sandra, are you still on? And if so, can you give that a little more explanation? Let people own the story of their life.
That was kind of a thing that actually I stole that quote from Jenny. Sorry, Jenny, I didn't ask you about that. we listened to the stories that were shared in our group, and we talked about how if people get the chance to actually follow their dreams and live to what's important to them and kind of realize that they have the power and the energy and also the possibility to overcome expectations and to realize whatever they might have dreamt of, or maybe beyond that even.
Wow. I think that's really powerful. We're up against the clock, and I wish I had hours to hear your stories, and you leave me wanting, and that's what we said that we wanted to do. We want to hear more. You leave me wanting. So I want to thank certainly Jack and Linda, who have figured out how to do some things that I couldn't even begin to think about. And before we go, any closing thoughts, maybe a word or phrase you want to drop into the chat, even about the what you heard, what you learned, what you're taking away, just a thought, a word, a phrase. Linda's going to be sending she's got it in, some feedback. This is, like I said, we're birthing something. I'm personally birthing something about stories, and you're helping in the delivery process. I can't thank you enough, because I did this hoping to learn as much as if you learned something from me, that's great. And stories, they don't stop. As long as we can share the stories with folks, I think people will continue to live, and we continue to give power to the people in the stories. I want to just read something to you guys, just a portion of a piece by Margaret Wheatley in closing. I'm sure she's got some folks here who are author and speaker, writer, from a piece that she wrote in 2000, so 21 years ago, called, it's just an excerpt from a piece called "Disturb Me, Please." And this is the summary of that, a longer piece. But if I read it, it seems to speak so much to the time that we're in, and continues to motivate me to want to tell people stories. So this begins. So what if we were to be together and listen to each other's comments with a willingness to expose rather than to confirm our own beliefs and opinions? What if we were willing to listen to one another with the awareness that we each see the world in unique ways, and with the expectation that I could learn something new if I listened for the differences rather than the similarities? We have this opportunity many times a day, every day. What might we see? What might we learn? What might we create together if we become this kind of listener, one who enjoys the differences and welcomes in disturbances? I know we would be delightfully startled by how much difference there is, and then we would be wonderfully comforted by how much closer we became, because every time we listen well, we move towards each other. From our new thoughts and our new companions, we would all become wiser. It would be more fruitful to explore this strange and puzzling world if we were together. It would also be far less frightening and lonely. We would be together, brought together by our differences rather than separated by them. When we are willing to be disturbed by newness rather than clinging to our certainty, when we are willing to truly listen to someone who sees the world differently, then wonderful things happen. We learn that we don't have to agree with each other in order to explore together. There is no need to be joined together at the head, says Phyllis. Margaret, I'm sorry. There's no need to be joined together at the head as long as we are joined together at the heart. And that's what I want to leave you with. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Derona.